In today's episode, a young woman tossing and turning in bed from the Florida heat decides to skinny dip in the lake behind the house. Despite several warnings from family about an alligator in the lake, it was too hot and worth the risk. Hit that like button and subscribe right now. This is the terrifying alligator attack on Michelle Reeves. Welcome to Final Affliction. Fort Myers, Florida is the kind of place where a 20-year-old comes during spring break or on a wild party weekend with friends. But that wasn't why Michelle Reeves was in Florida for the weekend. She and her father, James, had come out to check on his parents, who were also Michelle's grandparents. The pair had been retired and living in Fort Myers for almost 10 years now, and they seemed determined to ignore the fact that they were getting on in years. Just the week before Michelle's grandfather got into his head that he was going to fix the gutter that had blown apart with the last storm of the summer. Predictably, Gramps had made it 5 steps up the ladder before he slipped and fell. Luckily, he hadn't made it very far up, or it would have been much worse. So now he sat with his broken ankle up in the air, making poor Gran just as miserable as he was. It wasn't James Sr. who had called for help. He'd never admit that he was at fault for his predicament. It was his wife, Diane Reeves, who called James Jr. to come over and give her a break from the grumpy 73-year-old and his blasted broken ankle. So James and Michelle flew in all the way from Roswell, Georgia, to cheer the old man up and to allow Diane some support. Michelle loved visiting Florida. Roswell was beyond boring, and the change in scenery was a much-needed one, and she genuinely loved her grandparents. Besides, her term at Georgia University had been a busy one, and she was in dire need of a break from studies, activism, and her true passion, poetry. She wasn't planning on touching a computer or a pen for the next week. She needed the break from hard work just as much as her grandmother from Grandpa James. They arrived on Friday the 24th and were planning on staying well into the next week, but Michelle drooped like a flower in the heat. Autumn was taking its time to arrive, and even though Roswell was a pretty warm place, it was nothing compared to Florida. After spending all day Friday unpacking and strolling around the neighborhood to greet the residents, Michelle expected the evening to bring a break from the heat. But no, it was just as hot and humid as it was during the day. Michelle spent that first evening tossing and turning, barely getting any sleep in at all. The next morning, before she and her father were going to start fixing the gutter, Michelle put on her bathing suit and headed out to the lake that the retirees' houses were built around. But Michelle's plans for a cool dip were cut short. Diane stopped her in her tracks just as she was about to walk out the door. There had been a few sightings in the past few weeks of a large 7-foot alligator in the lake, and she told Michelle to march her butt right back in and to get dressed. Until the thing was caught or when it decided to find another place to make its home, the entire community had been warned to stay away from the water. So Michelle spent the rest of the day in the scorching sun, holding the ladder while her father fixed the gutter, then a squeaky window, and finally they repotted some of her grandmother's shrubs into bigger planters. By late afternoon, Michelle and James Jr. were soaked with sweat, and their cheeks were red from the Florida heat. Before her grandparents could dole out another job, Michelle sneaked off and hopped into a cold shower, leaving her father to clear the rest of the garden while James Sr. sat in a lawn chair, giving out orders. If it weren't for the heat, Michelle would have loved helping out. Her grandparents might seem critical and stern to others, but really, all of the scolding and bossing around was done good-naturedly, and with more love and cookies than Michelle's stomach could hold. The shower helped enormously, but by the time the night came again with its damp heat, Michelle was sweating all over again. Like the night before, she tossed and turned uncomfortably. She got up several times in the night to get a drink of water to cool off, and that's where Diane found her granddaughter in front of the fridge at 1 a.m. Diane dished out some ice cream for the both of them, and they sat for an hour eating ice cream, talking about Michelle's next big projects at school. The ice cream sure helped when she was in the middle of eating it, but by 3 that morning, all of the frozen goodness was gone, and Michelle was right back where she started, tossing and turning another night away. Afraid that a cold shower this time of night would wake the whole house, the young woman slipped out the back door and headed out to the lake instead. Without her grandmother there to stop her, Michelle intended to take a quick dip. She'd be done before anyone was awake, and no one would even know she'd been gone all that time. The water should cool her off sufficiently enough to allow her to get at least a few hours of sleep. And since it was completely dark, there was no need to bother with a bathing suit. No one was going to see her outside at this time of night. With the crickets in her ears and the air outside as hot as it was inside the house, Michelle left her nightgown on the lake's shore and slipped quietly into the black water in an open space between some wild reeds. The opening held a few canoes that rocked lazily on the quiet water. The relief was instant. She didn't even bother to swim out. That would just create unnecessary noise. She wasn't wearing anything, after all, and didn't want her family to see her naked. She wasn't ready for that kind of embarrassing moment. Michelle sat down, submerging herself up to her shoulders in the shallows. About 6 feet away from the girl lay a very confused animal. The alligator had been floating near the edge of the lake, resting right between two canoes. It was half asleep, and it hadn't even heard Michelle walk up to the lake at all. It wasn't until her feet stepped into the water that it jerked awake. The lizard was caught completely off guard and lay deathly still for a good minute, taking in the situation. Its initial confusion faded away after it noticed that the woman was so conveniently close that this would be a wasted opportunity if it let her go. The gator had eaten 3 days before, so it wasn't particularly hungry. But when a meal walks right up and presents itself to you, it would be almost inconceivable not to try to take it down. The seconds passed by, and the alligator crept closer. Michelle took no notice of the alligator's stealthy approach. It was 7 feet long, just about the same size as the canoes it was swimming next to, making it easy to overlook. Michelle was wondering whether or not she should swim out after all, when she felt something hard and heavy nudge her arm. At first, she thought a log had drifted against her. It was definitely dark and bumpy enough to be a fallen tree. But then it moved with such speed and fluidity that she knew it was the alligator she'd been warned about. Before Michelle could even sort out whether or not to stay still or to run, its white teeth flashed in the moonlight. It clamped down on her right arm just above the elbow. Michelle let out one strangled cry, but before she could even get any volume behind her scream, she was twisted so violently that her shoulder dislocated, throwing her head first into the water ahead of her. The gator didn't need to get its prey into the deep water to drown her. It just needed to get her far enough to submerge her head. So, as it coiled around Michelle's body, it rolled from the shallow bank until it got about 5 feet from shore, deep enough for the gator and Michelle to be fully submerged. As the alligator spun her in circles, Michelle's face managed to break the surface for a split second, but instead of letting out a cry for help, water flooded her mouth as she tumbled around back into the deep. Michelle had no chance. Her arm was ripped out of its joint at the elbow before she succumbed to drowning. With the amount of blood loss from her missing arm and her inability to breathe, it took less than 2 minutes for the young poet to die. As quietly as she'd snuck out of the house and into the lake, she'd been pulled into the depths, and no one heard a thing. It wasn't until 10 a.m. that morning, with the sun already high in the sky, that James started looking for his daughter. He'd assumed that Michelle was sleeping in after the busy day they'd had yesterday. But when 10 o'clock came and went, he decided it was time to wake her up to get started on the broken air conditioning. But Michelle's bed was empty, and Diane mentioned that the back door was standing open that morning when she'd come into the kitchen to make breakfast. Not yet concerned, James walked around the property, thinking she'd gotten up earlier than them and gone for a walk. But his eyes fell on the yellow cotton nightgown lying in the grass next to the lake. And then James knew something was terribly wrong. He ran to the place where the canoes were tied. and before he even reached them, he saw his daughter lying face down among the reeds, her hair fanned out in the gentle current and her body starkly gray against the brown water. Screaming, James dragged Michelle out, but her eyes were blank and her lips were blue. The ragged stump that used to be her arm was no longer bleeding like it would if she were alive, and her upper body was covered in red and angry-looking bite marks. Before the day was over, Michelle's remains had been taken away, and her murderer had already been found, lying in the sun, basking in the pleasure of the late morning heat. The animal was sluggish with its overfull stomach, so it didn't take much to dispatch of it. Wildlife and Rescue were able to remove Michelle's arm and return it in time for her funeral after her terrifying final affliction.